When I was younger, I spent many of my weekends with my grandmother and my great aunt at my great aunt's house in Reedsville, North Carolina. She lived right next to a cemetery, and there was a large and deep wooded area beside the house. At the time, I hated being home around my mother, who was abusive to me. So I used to avoid my house whenever I could, and spent most of my days walking through the cemetery and the woods, especially walking the small Shih Tzu my great aunt had. I was about 7 years old when this happened. It was late afternoon on a Saturday, and my mother called my grandma and told her I was to go home right away. When my mother called angry like that, I knew I was in for it, so I ran into the woods crying. I'm still unsure of how far and how long I ran, but it was far enough that the trees surrounded me on all sides for as far as I could see, and I didn't know where I was. As I ran and cried, I heard a sound coming from deep in the woods. I'm not sure what it was, but it was very loud. Without even thinking, I started walking towards the sound. Now, I probably shouldn't have done this, but at the time, I wanted any excuse to avoid going home to my cruel mother. Soon I came to a clearing and saw a party in full swing. A feast was laid out. There was music. Not like normal music, but like ballroom music, almost magical. And there were people dancing, wearing costumes of all sorts. I stood behind a tree for what seemed like forever, watching, mesmerized by all the beautiful costumed people. That is, until a tall, dark-haired lady spotted me and walked over. Without saying a word, she took me by the hand and led me into the clearing between the dancing couples, and everyone moved out of the way to make a path for us. Then she spoke to me. I don't remember much of the conversation, that part is a blur, but I do remember telling her about my difficult home life, and that she offered me a choice to stay with her forever in the forest, or to go back to my home and my mother. I was very tempted, since the lady seemed so warm and kind. Everything about that clearing in the woods felt enchanting, magical. But then I thought about my grandmother and how she would worry about me. I told the lady I couldn't stay. She seemed disappointed, but she let me leave, kissing my forehead before doing so and leading me back to the path home. For years afterwards, I thought about that encounter and wondered what might have happened if I had decided to stay with the lady in the woods. I returned to the forest many times since, but have never been able to find that clearing again. As time passed, I began to wonder if the experience I had was even real. But then, on a trip to Ireland, I passed an old Irish woman who gasped when she looked at me and said I was fae-touched. When I asked her what she meant, she just smiled and changed the subject. In recent years, I've researched the incident as best I could, and from everything I read, I now believe the lady I met was a fairy queen, or at least a very powerful fairy who meant to replace me with a changeling and take me as her own child. And to be honest, looking back at the years of abuse I suffered at home, I often wish I had made a different decision that day. I can't imagine life with the fairies could have been worse than my life at home. And even though now my life is pretty good and I rarely if ever see my mother, I still think that if I ever met that fairy again and she made the same offer, I wouldn't be able to resist saying yes a second time. Myself and a friend were spending the night with a couple who lived in a cabin on the edge of an ancient woodland. The cabin owners and others who've stayed there claim to have experienced odd things. For example, one man who'd been playing music said he heard drumming sounds coming from the woods that went along with the beat of his music. He shut off his music, and the otherworldly drumming sounds continued for a short time afterwards. Another visitor saw what she described as a fireball shooting through the trees near the hut, and could find no explanation for it. That night, we were having a small dinner party in the cabin, just the four of us. It was after nightfall and pitch black outside. We were far from the lights of civilization, and it was overcast, so there weren't even any stars. At one point, I went outside to use the outhouse, and on the way back, I heard what sounded like the babbling of small children, echoing from the woods. I ran inside in a panic and told the others what I had heard. It was so loud I was convinced they must have heard it too, even inside the house. But they claimed they hadn't heard anything out of the ordinary, and eventually we all forgot about it. The next morning, I went for a walk by myself in the woods. I've always enjoyed paranormal stories, especially stories of aliens and UFOs, and a part of me was hoping to witness something like that out in the woods. As I walked, I did start seeing things, but what I saw had nothing to do with UFOs. Out of the corner of my eye, I kept seeing flashes of a twee, medieval-type world, peopled with small, pixie-like folk. It was as if this other world was bleeding into our reality somehow, but only for brief glimpses. For instance, in pushing past a low leafy branch, I saw it as the decoratively painted end of an old-fashioned cart, the bit that attaches to the horse, but when I looked again, it was a normal branch. I really didn't want to be seeing this. Fairies were not something I had ever been interested in, and though I believed something paranormal was happening in the forest, the idea that it might be fairies just seemed crazy to me. I went back to the hut, but grew bored again and eventually ventured back out in the woods. I once more glimpsed these pixies around and about. Convinced I was hallucinating them, I tried to prove my eyes wrong by focusing on various plants and trees where I thought I had seen something. Eventually, I saw what I thought of as an elf queen standing on the far bank of a river, about 6 meters away from me. She was standing in profile with her lower body obscured by undergrowth. Her top half was robed in a tight-fitting cream garment with copper-colored trim, and she had brunette hair pulled into a matching ornate headdress. That elf queen, I thought to myself, is really a broken tree stump. A trick of the light, and my mild short-sightedness is causing me to see it as an elvish being. I learned this eye-focusing technique from a medical TV show for people who suffer sight issues, so I decided to try it out. I spread my fingers apart and peered through the crack that formed between them at the tree stump, and focused as much as I could. But the tree stump wasn't a tree stump. Now I could see in perfect focus a beautiful elf queen standing there on the riverbank. I saw her stitched clothing clearly, fine cream silk-like material trimmed with copper brown, and a finely crafted headdress. I now felt extremely spooked and stumbled back through the woods to the hut as fast as I could without running. I insisted my friend drive us home to the city immediately. Thinking about the experience later, I tried to rationalize it away. I'd been tired and a little bit inebriated at the time. Then again, I didn't see what I wanted or expected to see, and I feel my mind state had been rendered more perceptive by my tiredness and inebriation. And my gut instinct told me I did not imagine it. On returning to the same woods a few months later with some friends, to whom I'd said nothing about my experience, my instincts were seemingly confirmed. Out of the blue, they commented that they could hear children's voices babbling in the woods. My husband, my young daughter, and I went camping in a small pocket of untouched rainforest in New South Wales, Australia. We had visited this area once before, and while there, I thought I had heard a voice talking to me, and I felt irresistibly drawn back to the place. It was around dusk on the night of the full moon when we returned. We set up camp next to a very large fig tree at the center of the forest area. I sat down within the roots of the tree with my daughter cuddled up while my husband went to explore. I closed my eyes and listened to the evening falling on the forest. I could hear something off by the river, almost like music, but it was like the music was being created by natural sounds. Crickets, the wind, the river, and frogs were all harmonizing to create a distinct melody. At the same time, I had a feeling I was being watched, and I felt a breeze like a fan on my face. I opened my eyes and saw two figures fluttering just in front of me, looking very hard at me. They were dressed in a way that made me think of royal guards and seemed inquisitive about me and my daughter. I couldn't believe what I was looking at. As I gaped at them, they seemed to realize I could see them and immediately flittered away. I got up and stepped away from the tree. Soon after, the air became busy with these things, flying around the branches of the fig, in and out of the large gaps in the trunk. It seemed like a procession of sorts, and soon I saw a being I can only describe as a tiny queen. My husband came back around this time, and he saw them too, and watched them along with me and my daughter. Not wanting to interrupt the procession or upset the queen, we chose to leave. Growing up in England, I had heard stories of trooping fairies. What I experienced matched the descriptions I knew of from fairy parties, but never did I expect to actually see them in real life. I think fairies are beings that are just as much a part of our natural world as plants and animals, but they choose to keep to themselves, separate from us, and hidden. This happened in Nova Scotia, Canada on December 21st of 2012, around midnight. A friend and I had gone stargazing. We had ventured out to a beautiful place we knew of on a hill, where there was a large aspen tree that seemed to be 9 trees grown together in a strange way, surrounded by woods. So we were watching the stars when things got unusually quiet, and I felt a chill run over my skin. Then both my friend and I saw a woman step out of the woods. She wore a long silver, purple, and green gown, and had very long hair with 7 stars in it. It might have been some kind of crown. She seemed to be made of light. She walked from the woods and paused at the aspen tree, looking right at us, before walking into the tree. Then it was as though the shadows began to close in and something larger descended from the tree, like a giant spider. Needless to say, we did not stick around to find out. We left in a hurry. After that, my friend who was with me that night experienced a terrible spree of bad luck, which only ended when he later returned to the place with a gift and an apology. He never actually told me what he had apologized for, but I got the feeling something I couldn't hear had passed between him and the fairy woman. It reminded me somewhat of the old tales of Cuchulainn I had heard growing up. In those tales, Cuchulainn, an Irish hero, is approached by a beautiful woman who claims to be the daughter of a king, but Cuchulainn rebuffs her advances. She then reveals herself to be the Morrigan, a goddess sometimes associated with the fairies, especially banshees. In the stories, the Morrigan attacks Cuchulainn in the form of various animals until he finally makes amends with her. I wonder if something similar happened to my friend, and if part of the deal he struck with her includes secrecy, which is why he's never been able to tell me the full story of what he experienced. For me, the whole thing was a truly strange and mysterious experience. I remember it vividly to this day, and no, I'll never forget it. I live in a heavily wooded area in Missouri. I got into my automobile to go to work one morning and glanced at the time. It was exactly 7:55 a.m. I put the key into the ignition, but before I could turn the switch, I noticed movement in the woods right next to my driveway. I felt compelled to get out of the car, and so I did, and walked over to the side of the drive to look around. I'm not sure what I was looking for, but as I stood there at the edge of the woods, I saw a figure emerge from behind a very thin tree. Now, this tree was tiny. It would be impossible for a human or even a small animal to hide behind it. And yet, here was this figure. A woman, by all appearances, of average height, wearing a long brown and tan-colored dress. She had long dark hair that was pulled back from her face and was wearing some kind of circlet or crown that came around her forehead. After stepping out from behind the tree, she seemed to look around the woods as if she had just arrived in a new place and was getting oriented. After what seemed like a few moments, she turned and looked at me. She was not spooky or translucent looking. She looked solid and as real as anyone. The fact that she had just come from behind this tiny tree was odd, but I didn't feel fearful. She stared at me for a brief time, then looked around again. After a few minutes, she stepped backwards, back behind the very thin tree, and vanished. As soon as she disappeared, I felt like I had just snapped out of a trance or a daze. I realized I was standing on the edge of the driveway and I had to get to work. When I got back into my car, I noticed the time again. It was 8:20. What had seemed to me like only a few moments had actually been 25 minutes. I have had several strange experiences in my lifetime, but this was the first that I had ever had with a creature such as this one. I'm not sure if she was a fairy or a dryad, though she seemed connected to the trees. At the time this happened, I had built a small earth altar near where this occurred, and I wonder if perhaps it enticed the fairy, or dryad if that's the case. It also seemed like that thin tree could have been a kind of doorway or entranceway, like in Harry Potter when the kids pass through the wall to platform 9 3/4. If that's the case, it makes me wonder what the world might be like on the other side of that tiny tree. I was not born like others. I have known that most of my life. I was a stillborn cesarean section. As my mom says, I was born into this world cradled in the arms of Gwyn ap Nudd, king of the fairies and god of Annwn, who is also god of the dead. So this may well be why I can see things other people can't. It didn't stop when I grew up. I could see things out of the corner of my eye or hear things that others didn't seem to. I now and then saw creatures scampering under a bush or heard giggles or lovely music I knew wasn't human. My mother had this same gift, and so did my grandma. So it should come as no surprise it passed to me. I was brought up in a house of Welsh heritage. I grew up speaking the language, knowing our history and culture in many ways better than I did American history. Part of this education was in what most would call Druidism. I always knew them as the special ways of my family, and as a kid, I actually thought everyone learned what I did. A big part of my education was on dealing with beings that were not of this world and how to keep myself and others safe around them. Many of these things I cannot talk about as they are secret, and often for a very good reason. So, with that out of the way, this story begins. I was about 22. In our tiny rural and sleepy neighborhood, violent incidents are very rare, and any news of them gets around very quickly. So it was quite a shock when a child was bitten badly by a local dog. Now, that might not seem like anything special to some folks where this kind of thing happens regularly, but here it was. It also was the fact that the dog had escaped his yard and bit the child in his own yard. It made my ears perk up anyway, but otherwise I went back to my normal routine. Then it happened again. It was the same dog, a highly aggressive pit bull I later learned that had been badly trained and was behaving dangerously towards small children. Once again, the dog had gotten loose and this time had bitten another child. People were angry, not as much at the dog, but the owner, who seemed not to care in the least. Now, you might wonder why animal control never removed the dog or had it seized. Well, here, animal control was normally busy with mountain lions or coyotes or bears, and often were understaffed and overworked. I also heard they were intimidated by the owner, who, if the rumors were anything to go by, was an ex-con. Not long after, someone lost their whole flock of chickens to the same aggressive dog, and once again the owner denied any responsibility, and even accused the chicken's owner of setting it all up. It was by this time that I had begun to really pay attention, and then the problem was pretty much dumped right in my lap. There was an old woman who was friends with my grandma at the time. I'll call her Rose. She came to us with her 3-year-old granddaughter, who was screaming at the top of her lungs. She had been bitten by the dog, and it wasn't a little bite either. The bites were nearly to the bones of her tiny legs and laid open. Thankfully, my mom used to be a nurse and bandaged the girl. We called an ambulance and the police, and we were all livid when the owner of the dog not only denied it was his dog who did it, but denied even having a dog at all. Now, we all knew this was a lie, but he somehow had either hidden the dog from the police or had someone hide it or hold it. Either way, he got off without even a warning. While the little girl was in the hospital, Rose came to us and asked us for help. She said if her granddaughter was mauled this badly, next time someone might die. It troubled me, but I wasn't sure what to do. I was young and didn't want to get into a fight, but at the same time, I didn't want to see anything bad happen either. I noticed that same dog sniffing around the edge of our yard later that day just before sunset, and I had what I can best describe as a vision. I saw blood and the hand of a small child on the ground under the shadow of that dog, and I knew it was going to kill someone if something wasn't done. I sighed and told Rose I would do what I could, and knew she wasn't asking me for normal help. She knew what I was. She was asking for Druid aid. That night, as I did prayers and rituals, I prayed to the gods asking for help and aid. In particular, I prayed to Lord Gwyn, king of the fairies. Because of all the gods, he is the one I'm closest to. Then I did a summoning ritual. I knew it worked when I heard a sound, like the tinkling of fine silver bells. I heard laughter and giggles, and faint singing. I heard leaves rustling, and by the light of the fire, I saw them. They were about 2 feet tall, with pale translucent skin, bright and clear eyes like gems, clothes that seemed to be made of silks, accented by metallic leaves. Nos uith tha, toluith teg, I said in greeting. There was a sweet titter from the lead fairy, whom I'm fairly certain was female. If you ever heard such a voice, and you were not of the blood as I am, you would be lost forever in longing. I saw the glittering eyes of the other fairies in the darkness, and knew not all were in human-like forms, but that hardly mattered, and would serve just fine. Then I told them at length what had transpired. Now let me say this, while fairies can be cute, beautiful, lovely, and fair, they also can be very frightening when they get mad. And they were far more than mad. I could see ancient fury in their eyes, and while some were not in the light, I swore I saw some changing shapes, and the tiny glimpses in the flickers of the fire were something out of my worst nightmares. I put a bit of hair from the dog in front of the one who felt like the lead fairy, and heard the other fairies hissing. I have never forgotten that sound and hope I never hear it again. When the lead fairy looked into my eyes, I saw fire, literal fire in her eyes, glowing embers as if from a blacksmith's forge. The eyes that glowed in the dark were not those of a human, nor of this mortal earth. They were the eyes of something of the elder world. And, for maybe the first time, I realized why we keep our secrets like we do. It took all my years of training as a druid not to quake in fear. I was very thankful that I was not her target. The next day, I learned the whole neighborhood was in a big uproar. Everyone was talking about an animal attack. Asking around, I learned the dog that had been causing such havoc was dead. Stunned, I went down the dirt road to the place where the owner of the dog lived. What I saw there, I still remember as vividly as that day, years ago. The dog had been torn apart. I'm not being figurative on that. I had never seen so much blood. It was almost in a starburst pattern, as if the dog had stepped on a landmine. Pieces of it were everywhere. I saw the owner of the dog talking with a sheriff deputy, rambling and muttering. By the tattoos the guy had, I had little doubt of him being an ex-con. The deputies obviously thought he was on something with whatever he was mumbling. I watched as he went to one of their cruisers so they could take him and question him. As he got in the back of the cruiser, I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye, and glanced very briefly in that direction. Just for an instant, I thought I saw one of the fairies making a menacing gesture at the man. Then he suddenly shrieked and threw himself deeper into the back seat. The deputies shook their heads as they took him away, and not surprisingly, the man moved out later that week. I felt badly about the dog. It was really the owner's fault, but when you call upon the fairies, you can never predict how they will respond. I gave an offering of milk, nuts, berries, and soft bread for the fairies as my thanks that night, and prayed to Lord Gwyn, thanking him and his people for what they did as is proper. I heard their musical giggles and that sweet twinkling of bells somewhere in the night in reply. When I visited Rose's granddaughter in the hospital, she was on the mend. She said the fairies visited her. While Rose chuckled, I blinked and heard a giggle somewhere. I didn't look, but I whispered, Diol an avar, to luith teg. So that's my story. You can believe it or not as you wish. I know the truth. I still do prayers. I still leave offerings to the fairies, though thankfully I've never had to call on them in that way ever again, and I hope I never do. If nothing else, I hope this story shows you a little bit of what reality there is behind the legends. that druids are not bearded old men in white robes with sickles, and fairies are not all cute little Tinkerbells. They are to be respected and never called upon unless you're prepared to face the consequences of that choice. Thanks for watching. Those stories came courtesy of subscribers and the Fairy Census. Thanks to everyone who submitted their stories for this one. Some of the stories from the census were edited to make them more friendly for narration, but if you want to read the originals, the link to the census is in the description. Let me know if you have any suggestions for themes for future videos down in the comments as well. So this one was royalty and the last one was forest stories, and I'm always looking for new themes. What sort of fairy stories do you want to hear, and what topics would you like me to cover in the future? I'm always collecting your true fairy encounter stories, so if you've got one, I'd love to read it. My email, as always, is in the description. That goes for fairy art as well. If you have any to share, please email it to me with fairy art in the subject line. As always, extra special thanks goes out to all my supporters on Patreon. I really appreciate you guys so much and the support you are giving the channel and the work that I do here. If you like this content and you'd like to support it, please check out my Patreon page. A link is in the description. Even $1 is amazing, and thank you guys so much for that. Don't forget to comment below, like, share, and subscribe if you're new, and hit the bell to receive notifications of new videos. Oh, and please excuse my voice for this one. Hopefully it wasn't too noticeable, but I've got a cold at the moment. Alright, I guess that's it for this one. Until next time, this has been a visit from your Scary Fairy Godmother.